All-time favorite movies. Does anybody know what the name of the movie was? Beverly Hills Cop, yep. 1984, I fell in love with Eddie Murphy in that film. He had that incredibly sly smile, his humor, bad cop, good cop energy, self-assured, cheeky, let alone incredibly handsome. So Axel Foley was his character. He was a Detroit cop who had come to Hollywood, California, to investigate and track down a killer who he believes operated an arts dealership as a cover in Beverly Hills, and there was a Beverly Hills-Detroit connection. And Eddie Murphy just did not fit in Beverly Hills because he was from the D. Now, Jesus was no Eddie Murphy, but like the character in that Detroit police officer played Eddie Murphy, Jesus from the backwater towns of Nazareth and Bethlehem did not fit into the big culture of the capital city of Jerusalem. Jesus did have a different approach to tackling spiritual and political situations, just like Eddie Murphy also had a very different approach. And that approach was not necessarily acceptable. In this particular story, we generally call it the cleansing of the temple. You find it in all of the Gospels. Today's is specifically in the Gospel of John, and it places at the beginning of Jesus' 3-year ministry. The other Gospels place it at the very end of Jesus' ministry. But it doesn't matter where you place the story. This is one of those stories that really turn the heat on to Jesus. You don't go into any institution, whether that's a church, a temple, a mosque, a capitol, a school, a Pentagon, or even a Starbucks, make a whip, start hollering, and turn over tables and the ordered establishment. You just don't do that. I've been pastor of a few churches. I've been the director of several social service agencies. And you don't go in and try to change everything right off the bat. You don't mess with traditions. You don't mess with practices. You don't even mess oftentimes with the employees. Because if you do start turning the tables over, you will end up fired. In Jesus' case, you end up on a cross. At least you will be severely unpopular. So first off, I want to take some personal accountability. Leonard Ravenshill, a British evangelist and revivalist, said this: if Jesus came back today, he wouldn't cleanse the temple, but he would cleanse the pulpit. Now, fortunately, I rarely use the pulpit. But I do believe this quote is true. It really starts with those of us who are clergy, who are imams, who are rabbis. And in the face of all the sex scandals in the Catholic Church, the way preachers compromise their own truth and the truth of God to keep their jobs and their positions, and the apathy that we find among preachers who seem ego-driven rather than spirit-driven, I take some accountability for that. The story actually makes me queasy, because what you have here is you have a holy man, you have Jesus, a teacher, making a whip and wreaking havoc in a temple. There's this surge of righteous adrenaline that Jesus seems to produce as he shifts into this prophetic mode. But what happens is I realize that there may be more in common for me with the story and those individuals in the temple than I expected. Honestly, for most of us, Jesus is irresistibly attractive when he's confronting injustice and hypocrisy and the misappropriation of God's name. We are thrilled with his ability to speak truth to power so very well. We feel so justified when Jesus lifts up the lost and forsaken and poverty-stricken, and he gives them hope and he heals people, and people's lives are drastically changed. We love it when he puts political leaders like Pontius Pilate or Herod in their place. We like it when he turns on greedy tax collectors and he puts oppressors in their place and he calls them out on their stuff. But my fear is when the whip turns on me, on those of us who are religious folks, church folks, clergy, rabbis, and imams, and administration teams in churches, and church and temple and mosque leaders. That makes me uncomfortable. And it may seem strange on a Sunday when we like to invite guests and visitors during August that I speak so harshly about the church. You're in the church. The religious institutions and systems we invite you to be a part of today. We are a religious institution. This institution is over 100 years old. But Brené Brown says this: loving ourselves through the process of owning our story is the bravest thing we will ever do. So I want to own the story. I want to own the story of the church, the tragic story of the Christian church that all of us know. It has done a fair amount of damage throughout the world in its 2,000 plus years, has it not? As have Muslims, the Jewish community, and every religious tradition. We must own our stories. But it's honestly about authenticity. It's about no pretense. It's about acknowledging our humanness and the fact that we are at the same time divine. It's taking us as we are and taking each other as we are, warts and all. In beloved community, which, let me tell you, beloved communities are imperfect just as unbeloved communities, because community can be imperfect, but it can also be beautiful in its imperfection. So it's tempting to make a whip of cords today and take up that whip and flay around at the state capitol, the Senate building, Congress building, the halls of insurance agencies and hospitals and financial institutions, all those organizations that perpetuate inequality and injustice, and probably in several churches and mosques and temples. But I think the narrative pushes us into a much larger place, away from pointing fingers, but also looking at ourselves and entering our own sanctuaries, our bodies, your body, my body, which is a sanctuary and a temple of God. Jesus entering our hearts and our minds and overturning some of our own cherished rationalizations and driving things out that are unnecessary in the name of all that is holy. That makes me feel queasy. That makes me feel queasy. So the church as an institution, temples as institutions, and mosques as institutions, and pretty much every institution throughout history has really not done a lot of us a solid. We've been disappointed. Institutions get trapped in their own stuff, in their own cultures, and the voice of love and justice and equity and equality is stamped down. Now, my own personal story, for those of you who don't know it, is I left pastoral ministry in my early 30s, being really frustrated and disappointed and injured by the church and by church folks. Left for about 5 to 6 years, depending upon how you see it, and I kind of tiptoed back into the church. And it was because of this one quote from Condi that I actually realized it wasn't Jesus and it wasn't God, but it was really Jesus' people. I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ. Here at First Church, though, we are really attempting to do church differently. We've been attempting to turn our own tables and institution upside down so that we can keep the main thing the main thing. We've been attempting to hear the voice of Spirit calling us to be different, to not just talk the talk, but then to get out and walk the walk. And entering the temple that day, Jesus discovers how deceiving appearances can be. While the place was filled and it looks like it was functioning right and correctly, and everything was kosher, no pun intended, upon closer inspection, it revealed that that temple had forgotten the purpose that it was there. The trappings were still in place, but there was no heart. There was no heart. There actually wasn't much of a pulse left either. It had been taken over by buyers and sellers and consumers and marketers who knew how to fill the pews and meet campaign goals, but didn't have heart, didn't have spirit. Rumi said this: I looked in temples, churches, and mosques, but I found the divine within my heart. You see, what Jesus saw that day was a heartless, spiritless temple. It was corrupted from the inside out. They lost their humanity and they lost their divinity. They were not connected to the divine within and the divine without. Jesus was a social revolutionary. Jesus was a religious revolutionary. Jesus wanted to change the status quo and then ended up getting him in a lot of trouble. I often wonder what Jesus would think right now of the United States, of capitalism, of the free market system, where essentially the strong, influential, and clever do very well, and the vast majority of our brothers and sisters are either dying of hunger or barely able to make a living. My friends, we are called to transform our world by seeking justice, by seeking a fair distribution of resources that God has temporarily lent us. This is pretty radical stuff for a culture like today. It's revolutionary. It almost sounds dangerously un-American. It sounds dangerously un-Republican, and it sounds dangerously undemocratic, and even a bit dangerously ungreen, depending upon what party you espouse. Because it's not about politics. It's about humanity and embracing the divine within. I think Jesus' actions in the temple are saying that if God has to choose between worship and justice, then God chooses justice. Did you ever think about that? Worship or justice? There's a lot of verses that talk about where worship comes from and how we are called to worship from our hearts and our souls and our spirits and the bottom of our souls, but we are to be engaged fully and completely in this thing called worship, which I am yet seeking to completely understand. So bringing it down to earth, I wonder if we're willing to take the same risks that Jesus took to seek change for ourselves, but also to seek institutional change. Dom Helder Carrera said, "When I feed the poor, they call me a saint, but when I ask why the poor are hungry, they call me a communist." What a powerful reflection. Jesus' action against the temple precipitated his own death. That was a radical act of justice and love. You know, Jesus certainly had been in the temple many times before. They did this on a daily basis, sometimes several times a day. But he didn't turn over the tables immediately. I think the challenge is we never know when God is going to inspire someone to be that next prophetic voice and take that next prophetic action. From one angle, you could look at the action of Jesus in the temple and you could say it was civil disobedience. I think it was holy obedience. And finally, a feminist theologian and personal friend of mine, Rita Nakashima Brock, she writes that she learned to avoid asking this question of herself: what would I die for? She said, that's not really the question. If she asked that question, she said, James, there's probably a few people willing to kill you because you're on the margins. I'm an Asian American and a woman, you're a gay man, and it puts us at risk. Instead, Rita said this should be our question, and I think this is much more positive. What are we willing to live for? What are we willing to live for? That's the ultimate question right now, I think, in our country and in our personal lives, in our homes, This is a time of transformation. What are we willing to live for? What are you willing to live for? What are we willing to live for? You know, Rosa Parks, she was an imitator of Jesus, not because she suffered for taking the stand or for keeping her seat, but because she had the courage to believe in her own dignity and fought for it in spite of the conflict that resulted, because she believed that she had the presence of God within. Nelson Mandela, that we heard about a few weeks ago, imitator of Christ. Not because he suffered in prison, but because he held out for peace and justice and led an entire nation to a resurrection and a reawakening. In the face of this queasy moment with Jesus, I still haven't completely figured the story out, and probably will take it with me into the next life. As things begin to heat up in our own culture, I think the question is simply, what are we willing to live for? Jesus lived by example. Jesus lived for hope. Jesus lived for justice. Jesus lived for love. He lived to make a difference in his world. In 1962, which sounds like many, many moons ago, James Baldwin, a gay writer and an activist, said this in As Much Truth as One Can Bear, and this is what he wrote. Not everything that can be faced can be changed. We know that's true. But nothing can be changed until it is faced. Can we as humans, can we as faith community be a part of the force that works to face issues rather than ignore issues and do it off of our social media so we can have civil conversations? I want to be a force for change. I think that's all I really ever wanted to be. A force for spiritual change, but spiritual change that also brings a social, cultural change in the world. Jesus' actions in the temple got attention, that's for sure. It probably was that which started his ministry and ended his ministry. I don't advocate whipping up a little chaos, or do I? I advocate, though, the church to be the church. I advocate that the church becomes authentic and real, and that the church tells people they are loved by God. And that's the bottom line. And they are told that the divine is within, that we take seriously that we and you and I and us can be transformed, and that we can bring transformation to our world. I would like to close with that Rumi quote, and I'd like you to just sit with it, because if you get nothing else from today than this, I think that's really important. I looked in temples, churches, and mosques, but I found the divine within my heart. So say that with me. I looked in temples, churches, and mosques, but I find the divine within my heart. So take that message with you. Stay strong in that message. Stay vigilant with that message, and share that message with those around you. Please pray. Oh, generous and yet confusing God. Today, with this incredible story, we enter into deep, dark and bright, beautiful and painful, challenging and liberating truth and mystery. The mystery of this incredible being, Jesus, both human and divine, that walked among us, that proclaimed justice and hope and liberation and healing, but above all claimed that we can be reconnected to you as God, and we can reconnect with the divine that is within each of us, your breath. Bring us healing, bring us hope, Bring us transformation and allow the church to be the church. And for humans to be better humans. And for us to connect with the divine inside each of us. We ask this in your name. Amen.